Home Assistant is supplied with a number of add-on modules that allows you to expand its functionality. Now, one of those is actually a Samba server, which allows you to upload and download files. But how do you actually install Samba Share? And how do you configure it? Well, if that's something you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, because that's what we'll be going over. Now, the first thing that we need to do is to actually install the actual Samba server itself. And that's pretty easy to do. I mean, I'm already logged into the actual Home Assistant computer. But if we go down here to where it says Supervisor, click on there, it then brings us to a series of options. It actually shows you here all of the add-ons that are already installed, and out of the box it doesn't actually have any. But if I click on the option up here, which is Add-on Store, it gives us a list of all the add-ons that we can then install into Home Assistant. So up here we've got a section called Official Add-ons. So these are the ones that are actually made by the developers of Home Assistant itself. Whereas lower down we've got all of these ones which have been made by the wider Home Assistant community. Now the one that we're wanting to actually install is called Samba Share. Very easy to actually spot once you know where to look. But what you can do is you can go up into the search option up here. Just start typing what it is you're looking for. So if I start typing out S then A, straight away all I've got left is Samba Share to choose from. So it's very easy to find these sort of things if you know what you're looking for. And what I need to do there now is to actually just click on this Samba Share option. And then it's a case of clicking on the install button. Now before I do that, one thing I'll point out is there's some very good documentation. Click on that tab up there, and it does actually detail quite a lot about the actual add-on that you've got. But at this stage, I just want to click on the install button and install the software. So we'll click on that. And then off it'll go and it'll start to install the software. Now, one thing to bear in mind is it won't automatically start. All it's done is to actually install the software itself. Now, what we can do is we could click on the start button down here to actually start it. But what I actually want to do is to actually configure it first. Now, out of the box, this Samba Share service isn't going to start. If I do click on the start button, it's going to come back and complain that the password's missing. So we do have to do some configuration changes. So I'm going to go into the configuration tab. Now, up the top here, we've got a workgroup called Workgroup. That is the actual default setting. If you build a new Windows computer, if you're using a Linux computer, for example, to get access to a Windows Share or a Samba Share, as we're referring to it as here, that'll be the default setting. So unless you've actually changed that to something different, then you can just leave that as is. The username, on the other hand, I do strongly recommend you changing that to something else. I like that the devs have actually given you the option to change it, because otherwise that is public information. If somebody wants to hack into a computer, there's at least 2 bits of information typically they need: the username and the password. If they don't know the username, it's going to be a lot harder to actually break into the computer. So for that reason, we don't want to actually leave this on the default setting. Now, I would suggest using something totally different what I'm doing. I'm just doing a demo for the sake of this video. Once I've actually finished with the video, even before I've actually edited it and uploaded it to YouTube, all this information is going to change anyway, so it's not that big of a deal that I'm exposing this information to the internet. But either way, I would suggest go with something a lot more less obvious than what I'm doing. Now, one thing to point out though is that that username is different to this username. This one's used to log in and manage Home Assistant itself. This one's used to log into the Samba Share. There are different authentication systems, and you do want to make sure that they're actually different accounts, because when I come to change the actual password, and again, go with something completely different what I'm putting here. This is just for me, making my life a bit easier while I do the video. This information has the potential to get into the public domain. If somebody gets a hold of this config file that we've got here, there's the username, there's the password. Even if that Samba Share isn't actually operational, if it matches this user account, then the problem is Home Assistant, I would expect, is running 24/7. You've got access to the management portal 24/7. So if the hacker already knows this information, they'll use that to log into Home Assistant itself. And the reason I'm referencing that in the config file is that with these add-ons, it's the way they get set up is that usernames and passwords, they get stored in the config file. Each has got its own separate authentication mechanism, if you will, and it's storing their own usernames and passwords. If you ever run into problems with an actual add-on, chances are you'll go onto a public forum and ask for help. And when you do that, somebody might ask you for the config file. And if all you do is just select all the config file, copy and paste it, well, there you go. And voila, you've just exposed your username and password to get into this service. So for that reason, it always makes sense to use something completely different to what you're using to actually manage Home Assistant itself. So even if that does get out, you can't get access into the management portal. At least it's a step in the right direction, because when it comes to security, it's all about being as secure as you possibly can. It's always about layers, trying to make it as difficult as possible, because you can never be, in a situation where you can guarantee your computer cannot get hacked. I mean, yes, it's a home network. Chances of it actually being hacked are pretty slim. But in this day and age, we're dealing with a smart home appliance, which is going to be exposed directly to potentially smart home devices, where the vendor doesn't put that much thought into the security. And the problem then is it's going to be on the same network, especially when we're talking about devices that are using like Wi-Fi for communication, for example, or ones that plug into your actual switch. They're going to be on the same network as Home Assistant itself. And if that gets hacked, then that's got a potential jump point into your Home Assistant device. So these are things we've got to think about. Even though it's pretty slim that would ever happen, it's better to be prepared, as they say. One thing I'll also mention about this username is that even though we're going to be logging in as this Home SMB user in my case, it's only for authentication to the Samba server. When I upload a file, that file will get rubber stamped with the permissions of the root user account. So the root user will actually be the owner of that file, not this Home SMB user. So it doesn't really matter what I put here. For that reason, I wouldn't even recommend using the actual root account. It doesn't make any difference. There's no point putting a root user in here, for example. Just on the off chance you think, oh, well, I need to upload some files and they need root permission, or belong to the root user, I should say. It's not necessary. All you're doing is you're connecting into a Samba Share, and then that's taking care of the necessary root user permissions for you. So yeah, you can use whatever you like. Use, again, something different to what I'm doing. And one thing I'll also point out about this password, though, is although that's in plain view, at least within the configuration file, and it's just the way these things work, you can actually take an extra step, which is to create what's called a secret file. Then what you do within a configuration file like this is you reference the password out to a separate config file. The idea then is if you upload this configuration to the public domain, it doesn't actually show the password, it just shows a reference to another configuration file. So it's a bit more secure than this, but because it's a common process for other add-ons, I'd rather cover it in a separate video on how to do that, rather than actually doing it for every add-on that I cover within a video, for example. So for now, we've got a different user account and we've got a different password. So at least we'll be able to start the actual service, but again, I want to be as secure as I possibly can. So for that reason, I mean, the devs it's a step in the right direction what they've done here, where they've restricted access to this Samba Share to private IP addresses. So we've got some IPv4 addresses and an IPv6 range here as well. What it means is if for whatever reason you've decided to expose Home Assistant to the public internet, I know I've seen like YouTube videos where people have asked for how do I get remote access to Home Assistant, and people have suggested doing port forwarding, something I would advise you never do. If you really need access for remote management, set up an actual VPN connection. Manage it through VPN. It's a lot more secure. It means your computer isn't exposed directly to the internet. You've got to get around the VPN solution that you've put in to be able to then get access to it. Whereas if you use port forwarding, this computer is then exposed 24/7. So like I said, devs they've gone up in the sense of it's a step in the right direction, because it means if you've got a public computer, then you've got a public IP address on the public internet, and as long as these filters are working, they're going to block you from getting access to this Samba Share directly over the internet. But for me, I'm going to take an extra step where I'm only going to allow access from my management network. So I'm going to put in the range that I've got in at the minute. Could be more, more strict. I could tie it down to specific devices, but I want to be a bit more flexible in the sense I might have other devices that need access to this. So for now, I'm quite happy to reference the entire subnet, but just something to bear in mind. And the reason I want to do it like this and be as strict is the fact that we're dealing with smart home devices that are going to be in the same network as this Home Assistant. So if somebody manages to compromise one of those devices, they've then got the potential to get into this Samba Share. If this filter is working, it's going to lock them out. So that's the reason I'm going to do that. So we've changed the username, changed the password, we're restricting access to only certain IP ranges, and that's pretty much it as far as the config of the actual Samba service goes, because down here we've got veto files. So these are files that I'm not particularly interested in anyway. I mean, I don't need details about the thumbnails, icons within a folder, for example, so we can ignore them. Hence why they're not going to get shown within the folder over the network. Unless you've got an old operating system, you can leave this set to false. So that's what the compatibility mode means. It means it'll be compatible with older operating systems. So unless you're having login problems, you can leave that as false. If you do find any issues trying to get access to this, then yeah, you could change it to true. But in my case, I can leave it as is. So I'm going to click on save. Then I'll go back to info. Now, before I actually click on the start button, I'm going to disable that option, which is to start on boot. For me, this is what a Home Assistant. It's a smart home hub for the automation of my home, all the devices I've got. This Samba Share, as it says, exposes Home Assistant folders with SMB/CIFS over the network. Now, if this is running 24/7, it means anybody who's got access to it can change config files. So for me, it's not worth the risk of doing that. So I don't want this service running 24/7. I don't need access to it 24/7. I need to log into it, make changes in the config through the actual GUI process. Yeah, I might need to upload an SSL certificate now and again, but when I need to do that, I'll start the service manually. When I'm finished with it, I'll turn it on. I'll turn it off rather. What I don't want to do is the risk of having this running 24/7. So for that reason, I'm turning it off, because otherwise the computer will reboot and it will automatically start the service. So yeah, for me, it's not worth the security risk of doing that, especially when there's always the potential for a bug within the software that could be exploited, and this computer is exposed to smart home devices that are themselves vulnerable. Yes, I might block them from getting access to the internet, but there's always the potential that I could make a mistake in the actual firewall, for example, at some point. It's always about security layers, being as careful as you possibly can to reduce the risk in the event it actually gets a compromise within the network. So I'm just taking as necessary precautions as I can. It's a bit of a faff, it's a bit of extra work, but for me, the security precaution takes priority. Having said that, I'm not enabling this auto update. It would be tempting to have patches be up to date on the latest security fixes and so on. The only problem is, if you've got an automated patching system and it breaks the computer, you're going to potentially have to rebuild the computer. That's the reason I'm actually installing Home Assistant itself into a virtual machine, because then what I can do is I can take a snapshot of the virtual machine, manually apply the patch. If something breaks, I just roll back to the actual snapshot. What I'm not going to do though is running snapshots 24/7. I'm not going to take one every day, for example. It introduces latency. The snapshot is basically intended to be a one-off for testing purposes. You take a snapshot, test if the patch is still working. If everything still works after the patch has been applied, maybe after a day or two, you delete the snapshot. You don't leave a snapshot in place, and you don't certainly keep adding more and more snapshots. It just keeps increasing the latency, and it slows things down, because you've got effectively a drive with lots and lots of delta drives with all the different changes, lots of different virtual drives, if you will, that the actual operating system here has got a reference, and it just slows things down. So they're only intended for that one-off purpose of testing something before you make a change and rolling back if necessary. Otherwise, as I say, you just delete it after you've finished. Anyway, I don't want that, as I say, running, so I'm not going to enable it. In which case, what we now want to do is click on the start button here, and that'll start the service. It does take a bit of CPU utilization when it's first starting up, but because we made some changes now, I actually want to test this security. I've gone to all this trouble of locking things down, but does it work? Am I going to be restricted from logging in with a different username and password? Can I actually get access to this from a different subnet? It's all very well configuring things. I actually want to test it to make sure. One thing I'll point out by the way is that if I make an actual change here, if I then click somewhere else, for example, let's just double check what the documentation says. I come back to the configuration tab, that information's lost. You have to click on the save button. Otherwise, it just gets lost. So it's something to bear in mind as well. Anyway, next thing we need to do is test it all out. Now the Samba Share service is up and running now. So the next thing to do is to actually test access to it. So I'm actually on the management computer. So we're going to see if we can get access to the actual Samba Share from this computer, because we've set it up so that we've actually got access to the Samba Share service from our management network. So I'm going to open up the file explorer here for Linux Mint, which is what I'm using here. Now I can't see anything on the network, so this is basically what you would use to get access to a Windows network, for example. It's one easy way. The only thing to bear in mind is this computer that I've got, it's sitting behind a firewall, so there's no Windows browsing going on. It can't get direct access to it, so it can't see it anyway over the network. So for that reason, in the case of Linux Mint, I'm going to go to the File menu, and then I'm going to click on Connect to Server. It's slightly different, for other versions of Linux, other desktops that you use. It's different from Macs, different for Windows computers and so on. But I just want to be able to test it and see if I can actually get access to this actual Samba Share, whether it's working or not. So for now, I've actually got to put in the IP address. So 172.16.19.228 is what that computer's set up for. For me, I just need to reference the type as Windows Share. There's all sorts of different ways to get access to things. In this case, we're trying to get access to a Windows Share. Now, I could fill in the details, but what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to click on Connect. It's going to try and connect now. And as you can see, it's actually come back. And it's actually connected to the actual Samba Share, and it's showing me all of these folders that we can now connect to. The thing to bear in mind is it's actually connected as an anonymous user, because I didn't actually provide any credentials. And the reason I did that was, just to make my life a bit easier, because if I now actually try to double click on, say, that SSL folder, you can see it's referencing the fact that we've tried to connect as an anonymous user. But if I now click on registered user, I'm going to change that over to, let's change, just for the sake of testing this, I'm going to use the username of test, and I'm going to put a password of test. The workgroup name's already filled in, hence the reason why I didn't fill anything in on that login page to begin with. Just saves me typing all that lot out. In theory, what should now happen is I'll try and connect as this test user and I'll fail. But before we do that, I'll just point out, in the case of Linux, for example, I've got options here where by default, it's going to remember the password until I log out, which is quite useful, especially if you're going to connect to an actual share and then, go off and do something else, come back and try connecting again. It just remembers it for the, the duration of the session. Alternatively, you can be more strict and actually tell it to forget the password immediately, so it'll connect initially and that's it. After that, any subsequent attempts to log in, it'll have to prompt you for the username and password again. The option down there, which is to remember forever, isn't something I would recommend, because then it'll cache their credentials. If anybody manages to hack the user account on this computer, they'll then be able to get access to, in my case, all of the management computers I've got, for example, because the information for logging in is being cached. So I never recommend doing that at all. Anyway, what we need to do is actually test and see if our password authentication is working. So click on connect. Nope, didn't like that at all. Okay, so try a different user account. So try the actual proper one. So that for me was a rather simple one we set up. Click on connect. And now we've actually connected into the SSL share. So in the case of Linux, it actually maps the actual folder. If we go up the folder again, we're back into what is effectively all of the folders that are available to this, or at least on this particular SMB share that we've got. I mean, I can go into other folders though, and Linux will map those as well, because it's actually connecting to them. The credentials are all mapped, cached and so on. So it's pretty easy if you want to keep jumping backwards and forwards between the actual folders that we've got. But as you can see, there's all of this information, all of these config files and everything that are being stored in this config folder, meaning anybody who's got access to this SMB share has got access to your config files, hence the reason why I want to make it as secure as possible. Yes, it's a home network. Yes, it's a case of it's probably unlikely I'll get hacked, but as I've said before, I'd rather not take the risk. I want to make things as secure as I possibly can, just on the off chance something does happen. Now, just for the sake of testing, I'd say if we go over to the documents folder, I've got a root certificate, for example. Let's say I want to upload that to Home Assistant. I can go to the SSL folder, I can right click on it, I can paste that file over, and it'll copy it across. And so that's basically just making my life easier for transferring files across. On the other hand, maybe I'll go into the config folder and there's a particular folder like a log file I need access to. I can copy that, I can download that, you know, for technical purposes or something. One thing I don't want to use this Home Assistant for is an actual file server. I don't have a particular reason to do that. It's not its intended purpose. I've got a dedicated NAS for that sort of thing. But just as we've demonstrated, it is allowing access if you put the right credentials in. What it's not doing though is allowing you to put the wrong credentials in. So at least we know the authentication process is secure and working. What we don't know at this stage though is the actual filters working? Is it actually restricting access to those IP addresses that we've set up, or can we actually get access to the actual computer from, well, a computer in a completely different subnet? Well, this time we're actually on a Windows computer, because I know most people will actually be using Windows versus Linux, so I just want to demonstrate both. Now, in particular the case, I actually want to be able to demonstrate that we can't actually get access when the filtering's in place. In other words, this restriction where we're only allowing access from certain IP address ranges. So in this case, 172.16.18.0. So for that reason, I've got this computer in the 172.16.19 network, which is the same one Home Assistant's in. I can actually ping Home Assistant, but I want to make sure that I can't actually get access to the actual Samba share from here. So I'm going to open up File Explorer, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in / 172.16.19.228. I'm going to hit return. Now, I shouldn't be able to get access. And I must admit, I do get slightly different results. It depends, but usually what will happen is eventually, it could be quick, could be slow, it depends, as I said, it varies, but it should eventually come back and give me a network error. So there you go, network error. If I click on the C details, it comes back with an error code, and it comes back with the network name cannot be found. Now, I must admit that kind of threw me, because I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting something completely different. What I found is something odd going on with Windows 10. If you go onto the forums, you'll find quite a lot of people complaining about not being able to get access to that Samba share from a Windows 10 computer. From what I've been looking at, it seems that it's somewhere along the line there was a change made to the security within Windows 10, and it seems you just can't get access to it like that anyway. Now, technically, to be fair, if I go back to the Samba share settings, we're not supposed to get access, but even still, we shouldn't be getting that sort of response. Now, what I found is what you need to reference is the actual one, at least one of the folders. So you can see where I've been having a bit of a play around, but if I actually reference the actual folder, so I don't try to point directly to the computer, if I point the actual folder, this will work. Whereas if I point to the actual computer itself, it doesn't. Again, I mean, I must admit at this moment in time, I'm not supposed to get access to anyway, and I'll end up where it'll fail anyway at some point. But if we go back to our actual Linux computer, if you come to this one where we actually connected directly to the actual computer itself, and it then gave us a list of all of these individual shares. That doesn't work on Windows 10 anymore. Something's changed within presumably the security settings to stop you from doing that. And it does throw you, because if you go into the documentation, it tells you to connect using Windows using //, then the IP address, then a /. So there's something's changed, and it does actually throw you. I mean, I must admit Windows 10 can be a bit strange, I must admit. As Bill Gates would say, it's a feature, because it's trying to do something, it's trying to connect. It's taking quite long, and as I said, the time it takes can vary, but even the mouse pointer hasn't changed. Normally when the computer's busy doing something, the mouse pointer changes and it starts to go into like a spinning wheel and so on. So it does actually surprise me, I must admit, because I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting at least a sort of like a response back to say you can't get access. Now, it will eventually time out and it will eventually come back, but it varies. So there you go. Sometimes it'll come back and say network error. Sometimes it will come back and say permission denied. So there's something odd going on, I must admit. Anyway, at this moment in time, we shouldn't be getting access. And it was only because of the fact, for peace of mind, I actually wanted to test getting access and then taking it away that I actually found out this in the first place. So if I go back to our Samba Share, I'm actually going to make a change, and I'm going to allow access from here. So 172.16.19.0/25. So this time I actually want to be able to demonstrate I can get access from Windows, so that I can take it away, just to prove that this is actually working as expected. So I'm going to click Save, and I do like this extra thing they've put in here. Typically, even like a Linux computer, for example, you'll go into like the command line, you'll make a change in the config, and the change doesn't actually take effect until you restart the service. Now, it's the same on this operating system we're running here with Home Assistant. You make a change within the config file, it does not take effect until you restart the service. But I like this, where they've put this extra step in to actually encourage you to restart the service. So click on that, because if you don't, you'll end up just start scratching your head wondering, well, I've made a change, but why isn't it working? Anyway, that's restarted, and it is pretty quick to restart. We'll go back to our Windows 10 computer. Now I'm going to try connecting again. Now again, it can be, the actual time it takes to respond can be, sometimes it's quick, sometimes it's slower, difficult to tell what's behind it. But I know, for example, for one thing, this computer, it's a Windows computer, and it's expecting to do single sign-on. The idea is you log into the computer, and then whatever you want to get access to on the network, you should get access through that user account. In this case, I'm logged in as one user, and I'm trying to get access to a computer with a different user, or at least the server at the other end is expecting different credentials. So it can slow things down, I must admit. I mean, you can actually speed it up by mapping an actual drive. I'm just waiting for this to essentially come back and eventually prompt me for the credentials. But again, it's kind of odd, like where the mouse pointer's just stayed as a pointer, even though the computer's up to something, because it's highlighted everything. It is trying to connect. I mean, for like peace of mind, I'm going to go back and just double check I did put the right subnet in, but yeah, I have. So come back here. Oh, there you go. So it's eventually prompted me. So if you notice before, when we didn't have that setting in the config, it never even came back and prompted me for anything. So put those details in and put the password in, assuming I can type them properly. Click on OK, and it's actually connected. Now, I'll point out we've connected to the config folder. So we've actually pointed File Explorer to //, then the IP address, // then the name of the folder we want to connect to. Now, what's interesting, and I'm still scratching my head, is that if I click on the up arrow, I now get to see what I expected to see. If I click in this field, we're connected to the computer. And this is normally the way like Windows networks actually behave, is that if you point to the computer, it then comes back and gives you a list of all of the available folders. For some strange reason, that's no longer working within Windows 10. It doesn't stop me, as I say, walking back up the tree to get access back to the root of the actual computer to see all of the available SMB shares on it. it doesn't stop me actually going into the individual folders. I can just keep bouncing around from one to the other. And yet all I've done is I've just connected directly to the config file as opposed to trying to connect to the computer. So it's very odd, I must admit. I mean, if I open up another copy of File Explorer, for example. So technically now we've got access. I mean, I've demonstrated as long as we've enabled access on that allow list of the Samba Share, we can get access to it. But the one thing we cannot do is get access to the computer itself. We can't get a list of all of the shares by pointing to it. It's just going to spin its wheels again. And it is hit and miss, I must admit. We're allowing access from the Samba Share. Sometimes it'll come back and say there's a network error. Sometimes it'll come back and say the permission's denied, and it varies. It's very strange. Because you look in the details and it's still saying the network name cannot be found. So as I say, I'm just scratching my head because that's all I've done is I've just pointed to that, and that's what I'm seeing. And the only difference is I connected to that config folder there, the share, and then I just went back up the tree. It's very, very strange. I mean, I've been on the forums and it seems to be a common issue. People having problems to Windows 10, and it seems to be this. So as long as you connect to the actual folder, you're fine. If you try to connect to the computer to see what specific folders it's got, it just won't play ball. Don't have that problem with Linux. It's only specific to Windows 10, it seems. I mean, I can actually speed the process up, I must admit. If I right click here and go to Manage Network Drive, and go to 172.16.19.228, connect with the SSL share for the sake of argument. I need to click on that box there to say connect using different credentials, otherwise it's just going to take just as long. And that's the reason why I want to use a map drive, because it'll bypass the single sign-on process. It won't try to log in with the built-in user account and password that I've logged in as. It's going to prompt me for credentials. So I'll click on finish. We'll type in home SMB. We'll type in our password. Nope, I still didn't type it in properly. And now it's a bit quicker where but it's now mapped to drive. The only thing to bear in mind is if I go back up the tree, I'm back on the PC. So I can't walk up the folder, if you will, to try and get access to anything. So yeah, something to bear in mind. Now I'm going to disconnect this folder. Otherwise I'll just have a bit of a problem, because what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to disconnect the folder, and then I'm going to deny access into that map, into this Samba Share. So at the moment we can get access, but that's because the Samba Share's actually allowing us to. Again, I still can't wrap my head around why I can't just go straight there, why I've got to go back up the tree, but yeah, it is odd. So we're going to go back to our computer here, and we're going to take this permission away. Save the change, restart the service, and then once it's restarted, I'm going to try and connect again. The only thing to bear in mind, things will go usually a bit quicker now because we have already had access. If I signed out and signed back in again, those credentials that have been lost, it would usually take a bit longer, but we'll see. It seems to vary, I must admit. But I'm going to try and connect to the config folder. And this time it has actually come back very, very quickly. And it's actually saying you don't have permission to get access. So at least I can demonstrate the fact that that filtering that we've got in place does genuinely work. The authentication for the user also works, because we logged into a Linux computer and I tried getting access through a user account called test. It didn't work. I had to put the proper credentials. So user authentication works. And as we've seen on this Windows computer, unless you're in the right IP range that we've specified here, the filtering here is going to block access again. Now, as I mentioned before, when you actually connect to this share, what you'll find is that this user account that we've got here specified for the authentication of Samba Shares has no bearing on the permissions of the file. So I've got SSH access into Home Assistant, and you can see that's the root ca conf folder file that I uploaded, and the permissions are set for the root user. So the root user's got read, write, and execute permission. The root user group has got read permission, and everyone else has got read permission. It's got no relevance to that Home SMB user account that I created. It's just gone straight to root. So yeah, it's definitely useful, I find, but it's one of these things where, because of the security risk to me, I don't want this running 24/7, as I've said. So I've now finished with this. I've tested the authentication, I've tested the allow list. I can upload files, I can download files. So this worked perfectly fine for me. It's doing exactly what I wanted to do, but I don't want it running 24/7 because it presents a potential extra security risk that I could otherwise avoid. So for that reason, I shall click on stop. It's going to now stop the actual service, and I will not be able to get access to Home Assistant through this share until I restart it again. Well, thanks for making it to the end of this video. I really do hope you found it useful. If so, then do click the like button and share, because that encourages YouTube's algorithm to suggest it to other people who might find it useful as well. If you're new to the channel and you'd like to see more content like this, then yeah, do subscribe. Just remember to click the little bell icon though, that way you'll get notifications when I send new content out. If you've got any comments, any suggestions, if you want to leave any feedback at all, please post that in the comments section below. And if you'd like to support the channel, I've left links to both Patreon and PayPal in the description below. But above all, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.